Somik, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. My talk is titled Aligning Decisions with Our Values, our core values. So before I begin, I'd like to mention that what I'm going to show you is a preamble to decision analysis. So this is what you would typically want to do or think about before any analysis begins. So I'll start with a motivating question, then I'll introduce what I'm calling the dimensions of value, and then share value diagrams and show some case studies. So let's start with a motivating question. So the question for me was, how can we make sure that our decisions are consistent with our core values? And in order to even begin to answer this question, we need to achieve some clarity on value as a first step. So this research, basically what I'm showing you here is a very quick summary of 4 years of research. And so I will spare most of the details, but I'll get to the biggest or the most useful framework that I found in the field of philosophy. It is called formal axiology. And the axiologists are the folks who study value. And they have this very interesting framework which they look at the dimensions of experiencing value. So the first is intrinsic value. These are things that are valuable in and of themselves. Then they have prudential values. These are instrumental values, means to an end, anything that's good for us. And the third is systemic values. These are about concepts, constructs, rules, laws, ideologies, anything that we can count. In fact, any analysis we do is in the space of systems we've created. So all decision analysis, all optimization analyses are in the systemic domain. Another way of understanding this is that intrinsic values relate to our identity. They deeply affect who we are. Prudential values relate to matters of prudence, things that are good for us because of a story we have and to justify this. And systemic values are about systems we've built to manage our thought in an increasingly complex world. So as a quick example, brushing our teeth is prudential, but brushing in the morning and night is a system we've created to get to this prudential value. Another example, valuing the life of a soldier killed in Afghanistan from the perspective of the commanding officer of the soldier. And so when this commanding officer looks at it from the perspective of intrinsic value, he's lost a friend or a colleague who simply can't be replaced. Can't even begin to quantify or talk about trade-offs. It's just too insulting to even pose that question. At the prudential level, it's a pretty bad idea to lose a soldier, because now you have to deal with all these practical issues. You have to deal with the bad press, the morale in the troops, informing the family, recruiting more troops, and so on. So practically, it's a bad prospect. And at the systemic level, the statistic of troop deaths went up by 1. So you can see that this is, at the same time, a dimensionality and a hierarchy. So if you look at the same prospect at these 3 different levels, you're reducing the richness as you go from intrinsic to prudential to systemic values. Now, I want to make clear that it's not the case that systemic values are bad. In fact, systemic values are the only ways in which we can create something. So a philosopher once said that the act of creation is basically the act of limitation. When we create a pot, you're limiting the shape the clay can take, and it becomes a pot. So also with ideas, anything we do, we really are creating powerful distinctions which limit what is and what is not. And so limitations are really not the curtailment of our freedom, but it's the highest expression of it. That's how we really manifest our creativity. So it behooves us to create a space between the systems we design and the underlying values which inspire those systems. And so hopefully the idea is that we wouldn't be too stuck up about any one system, and we are more interested in the underlying values, and we are more open and more flexible to change and question our systems. So with that, I'd like to move on to value diagrams, which are a way of showing or communicating these sources of value. By the way, as Barbara has mentioned, if at any time you would like to ask a question, please feel free to type it in the questions box. So the picture that I'm showing here, it is an example adapted from Professor Ron Howard's paper on the foundations of decision analysis, where he talks about direct and indirect values. And here, this example is about an environmentalist in Africa who cares at the intrinsic level about wildlife. And so that is being shown here with a 3-barred thick arrow. So wildlife is an intrinsic value for the environmentalist, but tourism, this person believes, is a prudential value in the sense that the tourists help generate enough money to protect wildlife. So that's shown by the thinner 2-barred arrow. Now, a hotel operator in Africa says, tourism is a good business for me to be in, just like any other business, and I'm doing this for money. So it's a 2-barred arrow. And wildlife is also prudential to tourism because that's why the tourists come here. They come here because they want to see wildlife. So these are two value diagrams sharing two value stories. Now, a third person, a different hotel operator has a completely different value story. This person says, wait a second, tourism is very important to me. I love helping people see places and bridge cultures. This is a part of my identity. It's an intrinsic value for me, and it's wonderful that I can make money from it, but that's not why I'm doing this. And it's a completely different value story here. And of course, wildlife continues to be a prudential value. So here we've just shared 3 different value frames with this notation. Now we can put in systemic values. For instance, visa regime, which controls who can and cannot come into Africa. And any time we put in a systemic value, I'm going to call that value diagram a constrained value diagram, because we've just constrained our thinking, very clear black and white distinctions with constructs. So, and I'm going to represent that in the diagram with a single thin arrow. Now, as a reminder to this community in particular, most of you have been exposed to decision diagrams. These value diagrams are not solvable analytically, at least not unless we convert this in some way to a decision diagram, which I'll show in a bit. But this is really more evocative to help us understand our values. Other common systemic values that we might put in are budgets or FDA approval. But anything that passes the clarity test, the clairvoyant could answer, that would be a systemic value. Next, I'd like to introduce the idea of a canonical value diagram. And so by canonical, the word canonical is more about what's a little purer form. And in this purer form, I'd like to ban the use of systemic arrows going straight into the value node. And a systemic value must go into an underlying prudential source of value. And similarly, a prudential source of value cannot go in directly to the value node. It must go into an underlying intrinsic source of value. And so the comment is not that this must be so, but that forcing decision makers to think about their underlying values helps them uncover deeper and more important values. And so here's a quick summary. Intrinsic values are really declarations we make. There's no proof needed. In fact, one of the signs that we've probably reached an intrinsic value is people cannot justify why something is important, but it's super important. Prudential values are assertions. They are about evidence, they're about beliefs we've created based on logic, based on some reason. And typically when we treat something as a prudential value, we would want to check why we believe in that. And systemic values are constraints. And oftentimes in life, we are just handed constraints that we have to work within. Now to move to an example, this example is the value diagram of the president of Stanford University, John Hennessy. And this came after a lot of time was spent with the police department. So I was working on public safety decision making, and I created value diagrams for the police chief, and then went all the way up to the president to see if these were matching up. And this diagram remarkably was upheld by most of the senior administrators who were related to public safety. So at the prudential level, Stanford expends resources, and that affects the prosperity of the university. But the prosperity of the university is a means to an end, and it matters only because it touches on the intrinsic value of education. And education is really the ground on which we are standing. That's the reason Stanford exists, to teach and to do research. Now, in the context of public safety decision making, all the actions that we take around education have to be traded off with some other things. So, for instance, trauma to the individual that refers to somebody on campus having a traumatic accident and either losing their life or limbs or being incapacitated. These are terrible things to happen, and the university says we just don't want this happening. There's no justification. It's not about, oh, if we have these accidents, we'll have fewer students next year. That logic doesn't even begin. It's just that we don't want this happening, period. So that's an intrinsic value. And the third intrinsic value they seem to place a lot of emphasis on is coercion of others. And I've kind of put negative signs around them just to show that these are disvalues. So Stanford does not want to coerce other people. They are a voluntary organization, and they want to respect the freedom of others. So at any time, any action that they have to do, they really want to give a lot of thought to, are people going to be forced to do things that we think are right, and can we do this in a more voluntary manner? So those are the three basic intrinsic values of Stanford University.
So, Mike, let me ask you one question. You've got three intrinsic arrows going into the value box, but Stanford University obviously cares about a number of other items. Those are not shown here?
Yes. So anything that Stanford cares about in the context of a decision is in the space of prudential values. So I can make this diagram as complicated as I want to, but the point was to hone down on the really important ones that will probably stick around for pretty much any decision situation on public safety. So I'll very quickly show you how we can create decision diagrams to capture all the other things that we care about.